Welcome to the Pathway to Peak Performance. In this episode, we have Jeff Harp as our first guest. In this episode, the first part of it is all about his early days, and it's really important that you watch that because it leads into the second half of what's happened for Jeff in his career. It's a very interesting perspective on how to achieve peak performance in a very difficult situation, or in his case, a series of situations. I hope you enjoy it. Welcome to the show. So before we get into all the FBI stuff, let's go back. Let's talk about, childhood and sort of, you had the wrestling thing and, you're doing all those things that got you to a D1 school as a D1 wrestler. But let's go back. What were the things? I remember a story that you told me about, breaking your collarbone and still having to wrestle at talk about wrestling and the idea there is the podcast is the pathway to peak performance. Mm-hmm. So every single time that we get to some place, we're going to tie that back to like the mindset and the things that you're doing to achieve peak performance. And then when we get to the FBI stuff, it's going to be like, hey, like all that stuff that you told me about as much as you can, right?
I would go back before that. I would go back before when I broke my collarbone, because that was sort of already, things were kind of rolling for me. I'd already made the decisions of, what it took to, I don't want to say be a champion, but, you make a commitment to yourself and to others about doing your best. And I would say that, I grew up in a kind of Evansville's not a small town by any stretch. There's a couple 100,000 people, but it's considered sort of a rural community. It's farming community. It's on the Ohio rivers, blue collar work. Whirlpool had a big plant there. They were a major employer, and Mead Johnson. These are, mostly labor jobs. So yeah, I grew up in a pretty tight-knit community. The town's kind of divided in two sides. You got the West Siders and the East Siders, and the West Siders were the farmers and rural folks, and the East Siders were the people that worked at Bristol Myers Squibb or Mead Johnson and more affluent. So I grew up on the side where the workers were, and I think that has a big influence on anybody, because to me, it was, if you wanted to get something done, you kind of did it yourself, as a family even. You didn't necessarily have the money to go out and pay somebody to, like people here, clean your house, mow your grass. We did it all ourselves. When I was a kid, we were on food stamps at times, but I never felt like I went without. My dad was a railroader, so he would be gone a couple days. He'd be gone 2 or 3 days and home one. But I never felt like, I went without a dad.
Yeah.
My mom was a stay-at-home mom. So, I think if you go back and talk to any of these guys that are super high peak performers, and I've had conversations with my buddies who are SEALs or Olympic athletes or whatever, you all kind of have the same background. You all have the same kind of upbringing. Not everybody, everybody's got some sad story to tell, but it's just, well-grounded and simple and fun. I lived on a creek. My brother and I, whenever we would come home from school, we spent all of our time, we'd leave the house and go out into the woods. We had guns and bows and arrows and knives and shovels and pickaxes and building dams on the creek and swimming in it and catching crawdads and snakes and everything else. So, I started working on cars when I was like 13. And so it was just kind of that upbringing that made you realize that if you wanted to do something, you had to do it yourself, or you had to be committed to getting something done. It wasn't handed to you. Nothing was handed to you. My first car, my dad said, yeah, you're 16, you want a vehicle, there it sits. It's out in the field, it's on 4 blocks, and it has no engine or transmission. And I said, okay. So I put a motor and transmission in it and 4 wheels, and it rolled, and it was great. So it all kind of starts there. I don't think you fall into success or peak performance. You learn it. and it sort of builds upon itself. You find out what it takes for you to succeed, and you stick with it, and it's different for everybody.
Were you aware of it? I mean, like, were you did you make a decision where you said, "Hey, I'm gonna be somebody"?
I don't know. I had some relatives who were high-ranking officials in the government in the '60s. My great uncle knew the Kennedys. He was deputy director of the Bureau of Prisons. Wasn't a big guy, but he was a fighter. My grandpa was a fighter. My other grandpa was, shot down twice in World War II, POW twice. That's bad luck, man. Um, I think that I just became aware of the fact that everybody has potential. Everybody does. And you have to, in order to sort of tap into that, I think you gotta fail. And if you fail at a young age, a lot of people are discouraged and never go back. They never kid fails and just says, "Hey, you know what? I'm not gonna be good at this. I'm just gonna move on, do something else." And when I grew up in a community that wrestling was big, really big, like it is in a lot of the Midwest. And I, when I walked into the wrestling room as a freshman in high school, I had already wrestled for, I don't know, 4 or 5, 6 years. And I was okay, but I was a small kid. And so, wrestling in the 65-pound weight class, there weren't a lot of, so they would ask me, "Hey, there's only 1 or 2, once you move up a weight class." I'm like, "Okay." And I'd wrestle 2 or 3 or 4 weight classes up. It didn't matter to me, and I'd win, and they were just like, "Okay, well, see, you can do that." So it made me realize that, you know, the old saying, it's not the size of the dog in the fight, it's the fight inside the dog. Uh, my dad told me that years ago, and I'm like, it sort of resonates later. But, as a freshman, I walk in the wrestling room, and the wrestling room where I grew up, it's full. You don't have to go out and try to get kids to come out for the sport because it's full. You gotta cut people from the team. And I did okay as a freshman, but I didn't wrestle varsity. And I remember at the end of the freshman season, one of the things that I did, like, I was a big outdoors guy. I hunted and fished, hunted all the time. Hunting season coincides with wrestling season. And so oftentimes on Saturday morning, instead of going to wrestling practice, I was out duck hunting. And I remember the coach came to me one day and said, "You got to make a decision. Either you're a duck hunting or you're wrestling, because you obviously can't do both." Well, we didn't wrestle on Sundays. We did go to church on Sundays. And so if I could duck hunt early in the morning on Sundays, be at church by 9 or 10, then I could still go to wrestling practice on Saturday. So I was able to figure out how to do all of it. But the coach came to me one day and he said, after the end of the season, my freshman year, I placed 4th in the city, which was okay. But he came up to me and goes, "You're probably going to wrestle varsity next year, and we have really high expectations. Don't embarrass us." I was kind of taken back, I was, I don't know, 14 years old. And for a coach to tell me something like that, it was, I don't think it would go over too well here where we live. You might get arrested for that. But he told me that, and it made me think, man, I got to do something. And so that summer between my freshman and sophomore year, I thought, you know what? I'm going to work out. I'm going to bust my ass. I'm going to do whatever it takes, and I'm not going to disappoint them. And that's what I did. I decided to do that. I went to training camps. I worked out. I remember I used to run. I lived next to this small state university, and they had a road that went from my house. It was about a mile, and went from my house back to the university where where the university was built. And I used to run that. And I would run and I would hop on one, I was a skinny little weak kid, and I thought, well, I'm gonna build my legs up. And so I would run, hop on one leg for a mile, and then I'd turn around and hop on the other leg for a mile. Then I would turn around and hop on both legs for a mile. And then I would sprint back. And I would do that 2 or 3 times just to build up, because I was trying to make myself stronger. And my uncle was in the Army, and he had a weight set. And he gave me his weight set, and this was one of those old rickety, the bench was probably about that wide, and the weights, but I would go in the basement, and I would work out until I threw up. I would do push-ups, and I would lift weights, and I would do curls, and I would do all this stuff until I literally threw up. Then I'm like, "Okay, well, I must have worked out hard enough." And it was in my grandma's basement. You talk about, like, redneck living, man. It was in the basement at my grandma's house. I'd go down there and work out in this old rickety weight set until I'd throw up, then I'd come home and shower up. My grandma lived right next to my mom and dad, and my grandma's like, "You're gonna kill yourself." And that's kinda how it all started.
But that was you. There wasn't anybody saying, I mean, I guess the coach saying to you, "Hey, don't embarrass us." You knew you had to level up, but there wasn't anybody sitting there saying, "Hey, work out until you throw up, do these hops until you do this."
No.
You were figuring that out yourself.
Yeah, and I think, you have to figure that out yourself. And it's certainly, if it's one of those things you can figure out yourself, you're probably gonna be more successful at it than those that have to find out from somebody else. Because if you figure it out yourself, it's a little easier to buy into it than if it's somebody that has to tell you how to do it or what to do. Yeah, I knew that I had to do something if I wanted to be good at wrestling. I knew I had to really work hard. And as a sophomore, when I started wrestling, I knew at the beginning of the school year, wrestling practice was super hard, where I went. It was very, very demanding. So what I did when school started, I started running. I started getting in shape so I could be in shape for wrestling. So once I walked in the wrestling room, I didn't have to, spend the first month getting in shape. I was in shape to get in shape. And that paid off because I could focus on the skills rather than the physical attributes that you needed to do it. And we had this pegboard in the wrestling room. We had ropes and pegboards, and I was addicted to doing those. And nobody could do the pegboard. And I'm like, "Let me try it." And we had 2 of them. We had one that had pegs that went straight up and another one that was a square pegboard that had them in different spots. And you had to be able to hang on one peg, pull one peg out, and then put it, and sometimes they were crossed, and I would do that 2 or 3 times before practice. I would climb that rope 2 or 3 times before practice. I got to where I could go up and down the rope 4 times without using my legs, without stopping. And, I prided it sort of builds upon itself and it gets addicting that you see these accomplishments that you can do, and so you continue to do more. And I think it all kinda started there. And then I started winning at wrestling. My first varsity match, I remember I wrestled this kid, and he was warming up. He was, looked bigger and stronger than me and was running around like a madman. I'm like, "I don't know what's gonna happen out there, but all I can do is do my best." And, I went out there and won. And then I won again, and I won again. And I had, 10 wins in a row, and I had 20 wins in a row, and I had one setback. And, I remember the coach saying, he's like, "Just don't worry about that one. You got a lot more matches to go." Then I won another 10, then another 10, and, we came down to, and this is all as a sophomore, and this is important because this is really a turning point. People ask me about turning points in your athletic career. This is a turning point for me. So I'm a sophomore. I have 2 losses, and I'm wrestling in, the sectional tournament. In Indiana, it's sectional, regional, semi-state, state. So I'm wrestling in the sectional tournament. One of my losses were from a kid that was out of state. I wasn't gonna see him again. The other loss was from a kid that we knew if I won the sectional, which I was likely gonna win, I would face this kid that beat me in the semifinals of the regional. You had to finish first or second to advance to the semi-state. The coach came to me and said, "You're probably gonna win today." He said, "That's gonna put you in the same bracket with Wallace, and in order to go to semi-state, you're gonna have to beat him." And I said, "Okay, well, what do we do?" He goes, "Well, you can forfeit the match, and you'll be in the opposite bracket of him, and you won't meet him until the finals, if you make it through the finals at regionals." And I'm like, "Okay." And he said, "It's up to you." And I said, "No, I'm not forfeiting any match. I'm gonna go out there and win, and if I gotta wrestle Wallace in the semifinals, I'm gonna have to beat him at some point." And so, I went out and won the match in, sectionals and ended up facing Wallace in the, semifinal. I think he was ranked in the top 2 in the state, and I was probably in the top 10. But, and his brother his older brother, who was a coach, had wrestled one of my guy that went to my high school who was also a really good wrestler and beat him. So there was sort of a little bit of rivalry between the school, obviously, and then maybe my team and his team, and individually me being on the same wrestling team as the guy that beat his brother. And so we meet in the semifinals. If I don't win, I don't go on. And I had only had 2 losses up to that point. And so I meet him in the semifinals, and lo and behold, 3rd period, we're tied. It's 8-8. And I'm like, "Wow." I was it was just all a big blur to me. And it's super funny because I remember my uncle and my dad and my family were, like, screaming and yelling. I can still kinda hear it. And, my coach, after regulation time, you go into overtime. There's no tie. You go into overtime, and I remember walking up to him and saying, "I am so tired." He's like, "Bullshit." He said, "Bullshit, now get out there and kick his ass." And I went out there and beat him in overtime so bad, they had to stop the match, and they took him off on a stretcher. He was so exhausted, and the crowd went crazy. Nobody expected a sophomore. He was a senior, and this kid was ranked in the top 2 in the state. Nobody expected that to happen, and I went on to win every match after that except at state. I lost 2 matches. I ended up finishing 4th. I got beat by the state champion and, the state runner-up, so
But that was as a sophomore.
that was as a sophomore, yeah. And so to me, that was a really big turning point because you kinda look at it, and I saw what the hard work pays off, what you can do with hard work. Everybody says, "Oh, man, that's tough, that's hard work," and I'm like, "Yeah, you know what the saying about hard work? Hard work is hard. There's no 2 ways about it. Hard work is hard." And I realized that if you put the time in, you put the effort in, you commit to it, it'll pay off. And that's kinda where it started for me, and it just perpetuates and builds on itself. And that might sound cliche-ish, but it's the truth. Success builds on success. Failures are good to make you realize that you can, move on. I mean, I got beat. It was devastating for me to get beat. I took it super hard. But I had to regroup, and that's a great thing about wrestling. It's just you and your opponent and God out there, and only one person is walking away with his hand raised, and that's a tough sport for a 14, 15-year-old kid, to go out there and be humiliated in front of, everybody, because you are, and the crowds that would come to our matches were in the 2,500 and 3,000. These were not, 10 parents coming to watch high school wrestling like they do here. These gyms were packed. And these gyms were packed with people from the same side of town that were all farmers and rednecks and blue-collar workers. There were more fights in the stands than there were people watching the match. But, people throwing trash on the mat. By the time I graduated as a senior, I got booed so bad when I walked on the mat. I'll tell a story later about it, but you remind me to tell you about a story about a kid who was undefeated, and they called him undefeated in the newspaper, and in quotes they put NCJH. And that was not counting Jeff Harp. They put that in the paper. And, we wrestle at these schools, and it was a big deal to me, and it just became sort of, a passion. Winning is addictive. Losing can unfortunately be addictive because you get yourself down in the dumps and figure there's no way out. You start down that spiral. If you don't have the wherewithal, the gumption, the energy, the commitment to pull yourself out, you can swirl that drain and not come out. So that's kinda where it all started. And I would say that year, as a 15-year-old sophomore, that made me realize that everybody has potential.
Yeah. So where do you go from there?
Well, and so, I kinda bring everything back to wrestling. May not be everybody's, everybody may not see it that way. You can't always bring everything back to sports. No, you can't, but for me, that's kinda what did it. So, I came back, I went on and wrestled in the spring and the AAU stuff and did phenomenally well and was undefeated and got MVP, and I'm won all kinds of awards. Came back my next year as a junior. We never had a state champion at my high school, ever. My high school is over 100 years old. It's had wrestling probably 100 years. Never had a state champion at my high school. And my town never had a 2-time state champion. So my junior year, I come out, and my coach, beginning of season, says, "You're ranked number 1." And I'm like, okay, sometimes that's a hell of a cross to bear. In NCAA basketball, that's like the kiss of death.
Yeah.
It's like the kiss of death. Probably in football too.
You're just in your head the whole time.
Yeah, it's in your head the whole time. It's like you're competing against yourself and not your opponent. And so I just kind of decided, hey, look, I don't know what the rankings are or what they mean. All I know is what I can do and what I'm going to put forth into it. And what I told myself as a junior, I'm going to go out there and I'm going to work harder than anybody else. Now, I don't know what every other wrestler in the state of Indiana is doing. I had no way of knowing that. But what I did know is what I was doing. And when I went to bed at night, I wanted to know there is absolutely no possible way another human being could be working as hard as I am. There's no way. There's not enough hours in the day. I've occupied 24 of them with becoming better. So there's no way anybody can be doing more than me. And that, I went on my junior year and walked through the state tournament, became our first state champion. Then you come into your senior year, and of course, after winning state for the first time, undefeated, I was ranked number 1. You got a huge target on your back, but I knew, okay, this worked. Got to do the same thing again. Got to push myself even harder. Got to make myself even better, because now people know who I am and they're going to be gunning for me. And I went through my senior year, same thing. I ended up my senior year, the school that was our big rivalry, it's kind of like the Marin Catholic Redwood. It was close to us. It was Catholic school. Modern day, they hated me. It was the one, they had the kid, Tom Zenifer, who was a good wrestler, really good for them. I think I was his only losses. The Evansville Courier and Press was our local paper. They did an article on him. And they were talking about how great he was. He was an undefeated wrestler. In quotes, it said NCJH. And at the end of the story, they're like, and yeah, by the way, NCJH means not counting Jeff Harp. He had never beat me. And so, I wrestled him, 5 or 6 times during the year. And that's pretty hard to do. It's hard. Any sport, it's hard to beat somebody or a team over and over again. Eventually, they end up. But I knew in my mind, nobody was working harder than me. I knew that. Not only would I stay at practice, I was at practice every day. I would stay after practice and run the stairs. My football stadium at high school holds 15,000 people. So it's a stadium. They had a college bowl there. After practice, we had this thing called the Superman Club. It was all voluntary. And you would stay and you would run the stairs in the football stadium after you were completely exhausted. And we all, the better guys stayed and did it. It was a sort of a badge of honor to be part of the Superman Club. So we all got these T-shirts that had a big Superman emblem on them. And we wore those. And when we wrestled that modern day in the dual meet, they sold out. You could not get in the gym. There were so many people. And we were at their place. And we were ranked in the top 3 as a team. They were ranked in the top 2 or 3 as a team. And when you walked in, you couldn't hear yourself talk. It was so noisy. When I walked out on the mat during the introductions, people booed me so loud. There was stuff. People were throwing, it was like watching Barry Bonds up to bat and them not throwing a pitch to him and throwing chickens out on the field. But, we wrestled them. I won again. But that match was another point where, made me realize that you face adversity in life and you only overcome adversity by, sometimes sheer will. And we were about 30 seconds into the match. I had attempted some move and I heard something like a board break. And I knew as soon as it happened, I'm like, that's not good. And if I were to injury default, that's a loss. It's just how it works.
Yeah.
And so we went out of bounds and I looked at the referee and I said, hey, I need an injury timeout. And of course the crowd went crazy because you could tell by the referee's what he does that I took an injury timeout. So now I'm hurt. And I got up and I walked over to the coach and he said, hey, what's going on? And I stood there and looked at me and I said, I think I just broke my collarbone. And he started to raise his hand. I said, "Don't touch me." He said, "What do you want to do?" I said, "I'm going back out there." He's like, "Are you sure?" And I said, "Yeah, I don't know how I'm going to do this, but I can't I can't in front of this crowd let them see this kid beat me. No way." He's like, "Okay." Now, you probably get arrested for that today too, a coach allowing a kid to go out and compete with a broken collarbone. But I went out there and competed with a broken collarbone, and I actually beat him worse than I ever did. And my collarbone was broke. It was separated from the clavicle. The clavicle was separated from the sternum. And went to the doctor, and I think I went to the ER that night, and they did the X-ray and everything. Yeah, well, they put me in a splint. Fortunately, we wrestled them, like, the first week of December, so you still had Christmas break in there, so I took, like, 4 weeks off to let it heal. And, collarbone takes a little longer than that to heal, but I was not gonna not wrestle the rest of the season, so I came back in January and finished out the season, and I won state again.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So those are the kind of, those are things that, and maybe, everybody's done that. I don't know. Maybe my story's, not special to anybody, or some other person can tell you this one that's 10 times better. But for me, those are the things that help me, in my mind, set myself apart and set myself up for success and be a peak performer,
Yeah.
you know? And so I was offered scholarships to go to college at different universities. I chose the University of Illinois because I had a girlfriend at home who was younger than me, and I didn't wanna be 10 hours away, or, you know, Michigan or Oregon or some of these other schools that I had looked at, Nebraska. I wanted to be as close to home as possible, and the Big Ten obviously is the best wrestling in the country, and I thought, "Well, they're offering me an opportunity. I'm gonna go there." I was likely gonna have an opportunity to start as a freshman, and, so I chose Illinois. That's where I went.
And how'd that go? How was it like, now you're in a totally different category.
Totally different.
Now you got the cream of the crop.
Everybody's a two-time state champion in the
Yeah.
wrestling room,
Yeah.
minimum.
Yeah.
And I kinda, I came from this semi-small town, rural community where I was king of the hill. You walk into the wrestling room in a Big Ten at a Big Ten university, everybody's king of the hill. And as a freshman, you certainly are not top dog. I got my ass kicked the first few months. We started wrestling pretty early there. You couldn't wrestle organized practice with a coach, but it was expected that you started when school started. You went into a program, you started doing some sort of training program. And I hurt my neck my freshman year, so I was not able to compete as much as I wanted to. And I had school was hard. I'd gone to high school where I was majoring in power mechanics and shop, and I was not taking algebra, pre-calc, science and everything else. I barely got by in high school. Even I got straight A's in shop and architectural drawing. So when I went to Illinois, when I went to take the ACT test, this is a funny story. I didn't have a score. You had to have a score in order to be placed in classes, in what courses you're going to be in. They did not have Prop 48 back then, where you had to score a minimum to get in. So this coach schedules me to take the exam. I scheduled it one at the high school, and it's like a 3-hour exam or something, 2-3 hours on a Saturday. And I walked in, they told me the test was 2 or 3 hours long, and I said, "I got plans." And I left, and I didn't take the test. So the coach calls me a couple weeks later, "Hey, we don't have a score. What happened?" I said, "Yeah, I was really busy that morning." He's like, "What do you?" "Oh, I was going hunting." So he's like, "You have to take a test." He goes, "Now you're gonna have to come up here. You gotta drive up for the weekend, or drive up on a Thursday, and we'll schedule for the test Friday." So I went up there and took the test, and I pretty much drew my name with the bubbles, and so I got placed in probably the lowest classes that they have at the university, which wasn't a bad thing, because at least I had some foundation, some base to start with. I didn't people say, "Well, what math did you start with in college?" I said, "I started with intro algebra." And they're like, "What? I don't think they offer that." I'm like, "Yeah, they do. All the athletes are in there." So, yeah, I started, the bottom of the barrel.
Yeah. So, let's fast forward. You're wrestling.
I wrestled at the university. I was all Big Ten, um, team captain, MVP, most takedowns. So I had a successful wrestling career there. Um, graduate from the university, did well my last couple years. I finally figured it out. I kind of looked at it like I did wrestling as a teenager. I looked at academics the same way. Hey, I got to figure this out because there is no life for wrestling after college. I wasn't going into the NFL or the MLB. So I knew I had to get a degree. So I figured it out, got my degree, graduated, went to work for a company that was outside of Champaign. They did a lot of, they made wood windows and doors like Anderson. My undergrad was in forestry. And so I worked kind of in their wood engineering stuff. Then I moved to a company out in Portland. And when I moved out to Oregon, my buddy was a DA out there, an assistant DA. And he's like, "Oh, you ought to put in for a job with the Portland Police Bureau." I don't know about that. Yeah, put in for a job. So I thought, maybe I'll do that. So I thought about that, and my wife at the time, came out to visit, and she was in elementary education, and she was going to move out. We had a daughter, so I had a child when I was in college, and which is a whole nother story. That adds a whole new dynamic to your life. But I wouldn't change it for anything. And she came out with my daughter, and I picked her up at the airport in Portland. I lived in Redmond, which is a couple hours from Portland. We had to go over the Cascades, and it was a snowstorm, and it was a blizzard, and we got stuck, and it just went from bad to worse. And she decided, I'm not moving out there. And I'm like, oh no. And things really got bad between us after that, and we split up. I ended up moving back to Indiana, where she was a teacher. And after I had moved back, I obviously couldn't apply to the Portland Police Bureau if I was living in Indiana. I started looking at, well, maybe this law enforcement thing there's some opportunity there. And so I looked at the marshals, I looked at Secret Service, and I remember my great uncle, who was a deputy director of the Bureau of Prisons, always talked about how great the FBI was. And I mean, he was involved in some of the most notorious cases as a warden. He was a warden at Terre Haute, which is a death penalty prison for the federal government. He knew the Kennedys. So I thought, you know what, let me see what this FBI thing's like. And I went in with the attitude, the application is free, there's no charge, and all they can do is tell you no. So I applied to the Secret Service, the DEA, the FBI, and I was going through the process with the DEA, same time as I was going through the process with the FBI, and I decided that the Bureau was probably the better way to go, just because they have, you're not just working drugs, you're doing like 300 different violations. And so I went through the whole process and even got the temporary appointment letter. And then I got a letter from them a month later saying, "Hey, we're having a hiring freeze. We'll let you know if we're interested in down the road." I'm like, what? So that was kind of how the Bureau started. And that was in '89. So a few years go by. I moved from Evansville up to South Bend. I get remarried, have a daughter. I'm living in South Bend. I'm going to graduate school at Indiana University, South Bend, working on my MBA, it was a grind because I was at work 8 hours a day, and then I'd go to class from, 6 p.m. to 10 p.m., and I'd come home and study, from, 10:30 to midnight, and then get up and do it all over again the next day. It was a grind. And I was not a business major, and I had never had a business class, and I was taking, graduate level accounting and other business classes that were a struggle for me. And my roommate, who I was living with in Evansville, calls me up out of the blue. Says, "Hey, you got a letter from the FBI." And I said, "All right, open it." I mean, hopefully I'm not on the 10 most wanted now, which surprised most people. And he said, "Okay." So he read it out to me and said, the nuts and bolts of it was, "Hey, we're hiring again. You scored well. Are you still interested? Give us a call." So I thought, what the hell? So I called him, and I was talking to the recruiter. She goes, "Yeah, you did good in the last round of everything. We had this hiring freeze for a few years. "Were you interested in applying again?" I said, "Yeah, I'm got a good job." I said, "I'm going to grad school." She goes, "No, that'll help your application." I'm like, "All right, I'll apply again." What do I need to do? I need to do anything new?" She goes, "Yeah, we changed the whole process." I'm like, "You changed everything." She goes, "Yeah, you gotta do everything again." I said, "Oh my god, are you kidding me?" She goes, "No." And so I went through the entire thing all over again, and, I mean, I started from scratch. I had to take the written test again. I had to go through the whole interview panel again. I remember when I went up to Chicago to take the physical, it was kind of funny because I had to run maybe 2 miles, do push-ups, pull-ups, sit-ups, and stuff. And I was still in really good shape because I had been working out a lot. And I remember when I ran the 2 miles, on the last lap, they're like, "You have 2 laps to go?" And I said, "No, I only have 1." "How you got 2?" I said, "I'll run 2, but I only have 1." And the guy looked at him, he goes, "Yeah, he's only got 1." He was like, "Wow, he's moving." I did, I don't know, 40 pull-ups. I maxed out the test. But to me, that again that was an example of I wasn't going there to be a mediocre performer. I was going there to be at the top of my game. I know the process to getting hired in the FBI with a degree in forestry was gonna be ultra competitive. So I needed to stand out somewhere. Academically, I was okay, but I didn't have a degree in engineering, or I didn't speak a foreign language. I wasn't a lawyer. I wasn't an accountant. So they gotta take a few of the other people, and why not me? There needed to be something that set me apart. And so, I did really well on the physical fitness test, and next thing I know, the odd thing about the Bureau back then is the Unabomber case wasn't solved. Timothy McVeigh just blew up the world, or blew up Oklahoma City. Domestic terrorism was a hot topic. They just started rehiring again. They were trying to get people, they were putting like 50 people in a class through the academy every 2 weeks. So they called me up and they go, "Hey, we need you to be at the academy in 2 weeks." And I'm like, "What?" They said, "Yeah, can you give your employer a week's notice and get all your affairs in order?" And I said, I can't, I owe my employer 2, I mean, come on, you really, isn't it normal to give a 2-week notice?" They're like, "Well, yeah, you can take it or leave it." And so I went into my boss the next day and I said, "Elaine, I hate to say this." She goes, "You're leaving." I said, "Yeah." "Oh, what day, where are you moving on to?" I said, "Well, I gotta go next week." She's like, "What?" I said, this is like a lifetime opportunity." And they understood. They didn't, they weren't thrilled about it. They knew something was going on because the Bureau had to come in and interview them. And I always said, "Hey, I'm gonna give you a month's notice." But I came in and gave them, I don't know, a week and a half notice, and I drove to Quantico, Virginia, in my old Toyota Corolla, and I pulled up to Quantico and at the FBI Academy, and it all started there. I remember sitting in class the first day, and everybody introduces themselves, and it's pretty impressive to hear, and people are, you know, giving their best side. They're not being humble about everything, and I was pretty humble about my background because I was listening. They went in alphabetical order, and so H was about halfway through, and I had heard from A to G, and I was like, "Man, I don't know if I'm in the right spot or not." I think they must've went through the stack, and the guy was on I was in the do not hire, and he couldn't remember where it was at, so I got in the wrong stack. And I actually told people that. I said, "I had no idea how I got here, and I'm impressed by everybody's background." And I said, I'm honored and humbled by the fact that I'm here with all you people." Because there were some very highly skilled, highly educated, very successful people in that room, and we had to take the, physical fitness test, like, the 2nd day, and I thought, "Okay, maybe this is, something I can excel at." And they people scored between, like, 1 and 50. Nobody ever really got above a 30 the first try, and so I thought, "Alright." When I saw the test, I'm like, "What do you mean nobody ever gets above a 30? I'm hoping to get a 50." And they kinda look at you like, I don't know what planet you're on, and the very first physical fitness test, I think I got a 48, and they were, kinda like in shock and awe, and I said, "Well, I didn't come here to be second best, I came here to perform and be at the peak." And I said, "I know that I have a skill set physically that many, many people don't." And I said, "But what I don't have that I have to focus on is this academic side that all these people have. So I need this spare time that they're gonna use working out. I need that time to study." And that's what I did. I didn't slack off on my working out, but I was able to channel my energy and focus on the academics because I had already figured the physical fitness part out. Not that I was some like physical fitness star, but I didn't come there not in shape. I took it on just like I did wrestling. And I knew showing up, I wanted to be at the top of my game. I didn't wanna have to, go to what they call it, or not if you weren't in shape, they had a little session for you after class that you had to do. I don't remember what the power PT, and then probably half the class had to go and it was optional for others. Well, I wasn't, being, conceited or boastful. I told him, I said, "Look, I would love to do it, but I got other things I need to focus on because, going through the FBI Academy for those 4 months or 5 months, whatever it is like going to law school, and I needed to focus on the academic side and study. So while they were working out, which I already had figured out, I'm gonna go study." And so I did that. I ended up, graduating in the top of my class. I got the highest achievement award for physical fitness. I scored a perfect score on the physical fitness test and, got my orders to Los Angeles. It's funny, somebody asked me yesterday, "So how do you know where you're going when you get your orders to the FBI?" I said, "When I went through, it was quite the process, and it's a little entertaining, and they try to make it lighthearted and entertaining." And so one of the things they tell you when you get in is, "You're probably not going back to your field office. Probably just not gonna do that. It's just not how it works back then." And they said, "We're gonna put you in one of the 56 field offices based on your background and the needs of the FBI." And the old guys will always tell you the needs of the bureau. That's where you're gonna go. So that can be anybody's guess. And so what they did was you had a picture. You had a little headshot. They gave it to you. You walked up, they handed you an envelope. And this is at 8 weeks. They handed you an envelope and you open the envelope and you take the photo with a thumbtack and you go up to the big map and you put it on the board so everybody knows where you're going. There are a few people that were not so elated. I think a couple people cried, a couple people quit. Almost 16 out of my class came to San Francisco, which was unheard of, but the Unabomber hadn't been solved. So it was fun. It was really fun. And it was the kind of downer side of getting orders that day is I think yeah, so the day we got our orders was the same day that we had 2 agents get shot in my class. And so everybody was pretty down because, I was standing next to the female that got shot, and I remember hearing the sound. We were in the gun cleaning room, and the instructor was out in the hallway. It was chaos because we were getting ready to go to our white collar 2 exam. It's the middle of summertime in Virginia, so it was probably 110 degrees with 100% humidity. There was another class coming into the gun vault. We were leaving the gun vault. We were late on the range. We were late to our class. Some of this is kind of built in to cause stress for you. We had to go to our white collar 2 exam, which was a hard exam. The instructor was out in the hallway and he was showing another student trigger control. And most of the instructors carried a sidearm back then. I don't think they do today. He pulled his sidearm out, which he forgot was loaded, and he was showing trigger control, and as he was doing it, he cranked off a round, and it went into the gun vault, and it shot Tracy in the back, in her back, came out her stomach, and went into Joe's back, and, the bullet lost enough velocity going through her that it tumbled in him. I think he lost a kidney out of it. He almost died. Tracy's on the ground, screaming, "I've been shot." I'm standing next to her, and I looked down, I'm like, "There's no blood." I don't know, so I rolled her over, and I put my hand on her back, and there was blood on my hand. And I knew she'd been shot then. I lifted up her shirt, and you could see it looked like somebody had stuck a pencil, right out her belly. And fortunately for her, it went in her back, sorta in the muscle, fatty tissue, and out kind of the same area, so it didn't hit anything vital. Still, I think it may have hit her hip bone or something, but it lost enough velocity that it tumbled inside Joe, and he lost a kidney. He almost died. They had to life flight him out. The hostage rescue team is based out of Quantico. Their paramedic happened to be in the academy building. So he came in, they administered first aid to him right away. They fired the helicopter up and they flew him to, I think, Manassas Hospital, where both of them ended up recovering fully and graduating the academy some weeks later, but they both did.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's a wild thing.
It's a wild thing. It's never happened again. It happened one time. And you talk to people in the FBI, hey, I heard about a class where somebody got shot. And I'm like, yeah, that was my class.
Yeah. That's an experience, right?
Yeah.
So you get orders, you're on your way to Los Angeles. Talk about landing in the field office in Los Angeles.
Yeah, so I get orders to Los Angeles, and they assign you kind of based on your background. My background was what was considered diverse, so I didn't have like a specialty in, a pilot or a foreign language or accounting or law. So I was kind of like the rest of the U.S. RUS is what they called it. So the rest of the U.S. And so I was put on an applicant squad that you get farmed out to do all the work with all the other squads, and you're doing background investigations. And we were doing a bunch of presidential appointees, Clinton at that time, and they had those presidential appointees. You have like a 14-day deadline to get everything done. So it's like you drop everything, and the Bureau does these backgrounds. You have 14 days to get to initiate, do the investigation, do all the paperwork, and send it into DOJ. And so it's a grind. And I remember my first day in the office, my supervisor gives me a stack of freaking background investigations, or applicant. You do the FBI background investigations. And he's like, oh, yeah, by the way, you're going with, Squad C9. They're doing a gang raid tomorrow, and, they needed somebody, so I volunteered you. I'm like, okay. He goes, you need to go down there and talk to them. And I said, okay. So I went down to the squad meeting, and it was a task force of LAPD and FBI agents working gang matters. And yeah, we're going into Inglewood tomorrow, and get your packet and see where you're assigned and what time you're supposed to be there. I'm like, that's it? Yeah, I didn't say it, but I'm like looking at myself going, all right, do I need to know anything else about this? And they literally, I showed up the next morning at the sheriff's station in Ingleside, and I didn't know anybody. I just show up in my FBI car and my raid jacket, and they're like, oh, you're Harp? Yeah, you're assigned with this guy. Yeah, we're going in to hit this house. It's a drug gang thing, and good luck. So I remember the very first one I did. I remember we pulled up at, Dark 30 and hit the house, and you're an FBI agent. You're expected to know what to do, when to do, and how to do it. And there was no other agents with me. I was with like 2 other cops and, me, and there were other agents, but they were assigned to these 2 other cops. And I'm like, okay, you want me to do, okay, you watch this door. I'm like, okay. So it kind of went back to, well, I guess this is why they teach you to do things at Hogan's Alley. Hogan's Alley is where they put all the real life scenarios together at Quantico. I remember hitting that house, and we arrested the guy. No shots were fired. Everybody's guns are drawn, and they arrested the guy at the door. We went in. We had helped with a search, and I remember opening a closet, and they went through these bags. These bags were like full of cash, just full of cash. And people like, oh, aren't you tempted? I'm like, it's just a job. Just a job. And it's just paper.
Yeah.
Just bag it up and be done with it. Move on. Thank God nobody got shot.
Yeah.
So that was like my introduction into the Los Angeles field office. And so, after you do 1 or 2 of those things, you kind of get into a routine. And I did that for the first 6 months. And then they had a tryout for SWAT. And there was the second in command, the assistant special agent in charge, was an Illinois grad. And he was a baseball and basketball player at Illinois. So when I came to the office, I was assigned under him. I remember my supervisor came to me and said, hey, the ASACs wants to talk to you. And I'm like, that's usually not a good sign. So I went and talked to him, and he's like, yeah, my name's Chuck, and I went to Illinois, and I was a baseball and basketball player. And so it was great. So 6 months into my tenure in LA, they had a SWAT tryout, and Chuck came to me. I worked out all the time, and I got to know all the runners and stuff in the office. We had a big law enforcement race they did, and they recruited me to run in that race. And so I got to know all the SWAT guys. Hey, you should come out for SWAT. So they had a requirement. You had to do 2 years in the office before you could try out. Well, Chuck comes to me and says, go ahead and try out. I'm like, I don't wanna be that guy that, "Nah, go ahead and try out." So I tried out, and I made the team, and, I don't think some of the people weren't too happy about it, but a lot of the SWAT guys were my gym buddies. It's funny how you make these relationships in different settings. Well, the gym was the setting I made all my relationships in, and it goes back to that I'm preparing for peak performance. As an FBI agent, it's proven that if you are in good physical condition, the likelihood of you surviving a gunshot are 10 times greater than if you're not. And so I took that to heart, and I made sure that I was in good physical condition, knowing that I may be going on a on a raid with a gang squad, and if I get shot, it's that whole mindset. And I've never been shot. You talk to people that have, and the courses that I've been in, the real life scenarios that I've been in, where people are either shooting or shooting at you or you're shooting at someone, it's a mindset. And you have to have this positive mindset. And again, this kind of goes back to being a sophomore wrestling and beating somebody and having that positive mindset. It's all part of, what you think. If you think, there's an old saying they told us in the FBI Academy, if you get shot and you think you're gonna die, you're likely gonna die. So, you need to have that positive outlook on life and positive mindset.
Mhm. So, go to SWAT.
So I was on the SWAT team for about a year, and, they had a
And this is LA
this
SWAT.
is LA SWAT. Yeah, so I was on the SWAT team for a year. So in LA SWAT down there, they're involved in a lot of high risk stuff. And back then it was in the height of gangs and drugs. And so we did a bunch of high risk things. I went to several kidnappings and, people holding knives or guns to somebody's head or throat. And so, it was pretty eye opening to be involved in those kind of operations. The team leader of the SWAT team was a former hostage rescue team member. So we had, a fairly decent and robust training scenarios, and we had good equipment. For SWAT teams go, LA SWAT was pretty highly thought of and pretty well equipped. And so I was on the SWAT team about a year, and I remember a guy in the office came to me and said, "Hey, they're having a tryout for the hostage rescue team." I'm like, "Okay." He goes, "Oh, you should go out." And I'm like, "Yeah, I don't I I barely meet the minimum requirement." I said, "I've just passed, like, my 2 years or 2.5 years," what it was, and they said, "Oh, you should do this," and I'm like, I don't know." So I looked at it, and I had a daughter that was, living in Philadelphia at the time, and, selfishly, I'm like, "Well, if I make this team, I'll be back on the East Coast, never lived there, but I'll be close to my daughter, so why not?" So my SWAT team leader, usually what happens is your SWAT team leader endorses you. You send this package back. My SWAT team was out on vacation the day it was all due. And so I talked to my supervisor, and the ASAC's like, "I send it in." He goes, "I'll give you your endorsement." And so I was approved to try out for the hostage rescue team. All the paperwork went back, and I got notified, "Hey, you can try out."
I mean, and the people that don't know, HRT is the elite of the elite. I mean, this is the national SWAT team.
It's a tier 1 asset like Delta and SEAL Team 6. They do a lot of training with the military groups. They're a counterterrorism response team. Yeah, they have national responsibility for any major event. The Olympics, I've been to a couple different Olympics. Anything that is really, really, really critical. We did a couple operations in Virginia Beach with the Hells Angels. So yeah, they're very top tier. All they do is we called it training and working out or being on an athletic scholarship. So some of the guys, my coworkers at the academy would say, "Hey, you still on that athletic scholarship? You've been milking that for a lot of years now." But yeah, so it's an elite group of guys, and most of the guys on the team, former military, former special forces, former, Navy SEALs, former Delta operators. So these are really high speed guys that are usually in their late 20s, early 30s. So they're, for a man, that's not old. I mean, kind of peak performance. You look at Olympic athletes for males, you start looking at ages of like 24 to maybe 31, 32. Those are really critical years for you being in top physical condition, top mental condition, because you may have a little more piss and vinegar in you at 18 or 19, but you don't have it there mentally. And I think that's why there's a big advantage for it in college football for these guys that go into the military and come out at 20 and they got 4 years left to compete in college at the college level. They're mentally way better off than they were as a high school 18-year-old. So yeah, these are grown men. And the other thing that makes it unique is these are grown men with full-time jobs. They're not fighting for their job. You don't have to go back and do that. You got a job. And many have families. So it's a hell of a commitment. And so, yeah, you go back for 2 weeks. I remember when I got selected to go back, I was an avid outdoorsman. I'm like, man, I got to take care of my feet. They had like these secret groups that would give you like, this is what's going to happen, during the 2 weeks, or the last 2 years they've done this during the 14 days. And so there was kind of a hump out there as what was going to occur in the 14 days. And I never looked at it. I'm like, they can't shoot bullets at me, you know, and I'm gonna be it's super challenging physically. Since they can't shoot bullets at you, the only thing they can do is wear you down mentally and physically and see how you perform. So I thought to myself, well, here we go back to my wrestling, the mental toughness for wrestling. I'm not gonna let that be the thing that breaks me because I'm gonna be prepared physically. I don't care what they throw at me. There's nothing they can throw at me that I haven't thrown at myself physically. And so, yeah, I went back for the 2 weeks, and it was tough. It was really tough.
You had course navigation, you've got
Navigation, everything. It's like they try to when they designed this 2-week course, they went to the Army and they went to the Navy, and they said, "Okay, for your special forces, yeah, you guys got 6 months to do this qualification course. We don't have 6 months. Tell us what we can do in 14 days. Buds, you've got Hell Week, you've got a finite period of time in Buds, but it's still longer. What do you do that we can, mimic that?" And so we kind of, and the hostage rescue team adopted sort of this training curriculum for selection that they felt was as good as they could get. They had a finite period of time, and they'd be able to use their evaluation in that, 14-day period. So yeah, so you go back there for the 14 days, and the very first thing you do is you shoot. If you can't qualify shooting, well, there's no sense in going any further. And some people fail out from the firearms qual the first day. Usually about 50 people show up for the selection. That's about normal.
And so how many people make it through?
Yeah, that's always a real good question. And everybody says, year to year, it's funny. It never changes. It may fluctuate a little here, may fluctuate a little there. There's about a 25% graduation rate out of the 2 weeks.
Yeah, they're pushing it.
Yeah, and that's about normal. I went through in July, which they stopped. They don't do them in July anymore.
Too hot.
Too hot. They had people going. First day, we took people off on IVs because one guy almost died. So they decided to quit doing it in July just because of the heat factor. The selection is hard on the participant. It's tough on the operator. The operator's got to be there every step of the way. Obviously we know what's coming along. We still got to be there to evaluate.
Yeah.
So yeah, you got people fail out the first day. Very first day you take a physical fitness test, and it's not the same FBI physical fitness test. It's very rigorous. And I wanted to know, again, I go back to my wrestling mentality. I need to be at my peak level, my peak performance level for this, because I don't want to be in the middle of the pack. I don't want to be the guy that they're looking at going, yeah, he's on the border. No, that's not how you get over the hump. You get over the hump by being now, this guy physically freaking knocked it out of the park. Well, let's see how they did everything else. So I wanted to allow myself to focus on, I wasn't a former special forces operator. I wasn't a Delta guy. I wasn't a SEAL. So I wanted to make damn sure that what I didn't have to worry about was the physical side, because that's what most people fail. And I'm like, okay, if I can get over that hump, that gives me the ability to focus on this other stuff, this tactical stuff that I have to do, the shooting, the sleep deprivation, the grind you have to go through and stay mentally sharp, the arrest scenarios. If you're physically exhausted, that impacts all this other stuff. And they know that, but that's how they weed the people out. Can't shoot live bullets at you. They could raise your stress level up and see how you react. But if you're in top physical condition, that's just one more thing you don't have to worry about.
Yeah.
And I have very good friends that are SEALs. My college roommate was a SEAL. Very close friends on SEAL Team 6. And, they're like, yeah, if you've got to kind of figure out what you can and can't do. And if there's things that, like going out for the hostage rescue team, if there's things that I can do, let's make sure that I'm at the absolute top of my game for those. So the things that I am not sure about are the ones that I can worry about and focus on.
Yeah. So HRT, so LA SWAT, you're working, hey, bank robberies, got a hostage situation, you're lining up on those dudes, and now you're in a totally different category.
Totally different category.
I mean, you're flying to
worldwide.
Yeah, just wherever you need to go.
Yep.
Handling major action.
Some of it covert.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're involved in, you're working with all the other government agencies, whatever 3-letter word is operating overseas, you're working with them. You're working with the military groups. You're working with the foreign government military groups, the foreign government special forces groups. You're working with all those. And people don't really have a total grasp or understanding what the hostage rescue team does. Maybe if you play Ghost Recon, a kid's heard of it, But, a lot of people don't know because they don't advertise it. They don't brag it. It was born out of the '84 Olympics, and they didn't want what happened in Munich to happen in Los Angeles. And so they're like, hey, we need a team that can respond to this. And the whole posse comitatus and military involvement, there's ways to kind of navigate that. But if you have a civilian, non-Department of Defense special forces team, that gives you a lot more latitude for those sort of special operations.
Yep. You can move differently.
You can move differently. You can deploy people easier. It doesn't take a presidential act to get the military involved. You don't have to declare martial law. These are civilian, paramilitary, special forces light groups.
Yeah. So we can go on and talk a lot about a lot of different stories. Let's talk about the USS Cole.
Okay. So I had just gotten remarried again.
Seems like the FBI career path, tough on marriages, right?
Well, so yeah, that's another whole story itself. But so the FBI, there's some statistics, at least when I was in, that they're not so proud of. One, they had the highest rate of suicide of all law enforcement. I personally know 7 people that have taken their own lives with their firearm. 7. I know personally. Second, they have the highest rate of divorce of all law enforcement. Law enforcement has the highest rate of divorce of any other group in the country. The FBI is the subset that has the highest. Within the FBI, the hostage rescue team has the highest rate of divorce. So yes, it's tough on the family. It's tough on marriage. I had just gotten married. I'm not going to say what number that was, but it was again. And my young wife was not from there. And this is, I think the Cole was October 10th-ish, somewhere in that neighborhood. I'd gotten married in September, so I'd been married a whole 30 days. And get a call in the middle of the night. You got to be at Quantico. For what? You don't know. You just know that, so I'd been on the team a couple of years, and you always leave on a Friday with your bags packed, ready to go because you never knew. And, I always took pride in the fact that I never put a gun away that wasn't clean. And so all of my equipment, I'm kind of very OCD about it. And, you tend to see that there's a lot of guys that are in that category that are on these teams. It's like if you go to the military academy, my very good friend Jim, West Point graduate, you go to his house, I'd move something like out of the square corner and you'd see him walk around and he'd go back and he'd put it back. Or the corner of his bed was made up perfectly. You'd just pull the sheet down a little bit. You'd see him go into his room and he'd fix the sheet again. So yeah, it's a little bit over the top OCD, but you know, there's a study that was done, and there's a lot of Olympic athletes that are OCD and that are suffering from ADHD, and they were able to be peak performance by harnessing and channeling those attributes into peak performance. So I don't know. I was probably ADHD as a kid. I've never been looked at or diagnosed, but everybody says, man, they used to call me the monkey on crack. So I don't know. Maybe I had some severe case that should have been diagnosed at some point, maybe as an adult too.
Yeah. So you get orders USS Cole, or you get orders, right?
Yeah.
Called to Quantico.
We had pagers back then. So you'd get there was a code on the pager, I think, and it meant to go to Quantico. And I kind of had a sense of what was going to happen, or that we were going to get called, because the explosion happened. Obviously they're 12 or so hours ahead of us. We hear it on the news. It's a U.S. interest, obviously overseas. And so I kind of had the feeling that we were going to get called. So when we got called, we go to Quantico. We're loading up everything in our trucks, taking them up to Andrews Air Force Base, where we load everything at that time we were using a C-141 military plane. And we would, we load up everything. We load up helicopters and Humvees and armored personnel. We had the capability to fully deploy as a military unit. And we sent an advance group over, and I was in that advance group. We had, I don't know, maybe 40 people in the advance, and just to kind of look at things, set it up, and kind of establish what we needed on the follow-on. We got there, and we kind of Yemen was not a friendly country as far as military assets in the country go. Mm-hmm. I think Clinton had opened up that port for refueling purposes because it was, shorter. Yeah, we needed it. We used a lot of fuel, and we went around, I guess, maybe Suez Canal or whatever. So it was important for us to kind of go back through the Med there, or Red Sea, whatever it is. And so, yeah, in Aden at the port, they had taken Al Qaeda. They had taken a raft, like a Zodiac, full of explosives, 2,500 pounds, and pulled it up to the ship. And they blew a hole in the ship, damn near sank the ship. And if you've never been on a ship, the hull of those ships are solid steel, and they aren't like your pleasure boat where you've got a thin thing of fiberglass in it. These things are thick, and it ripped that ship open like a can opener. And there were 17 sailors that died immediately. Unfortunately, they pulled that boat up that had the explosives in it next to the enlisted men's mess, and that's where it went off. And so when you went into the mess hall on that ship, I mean, I'm not trying to be insensitive or gory, but it looked like freaking somebody throwing hamburger meat against the wall. It was a god-awful scene. And 17 sailors died. 30 or 40 other people were seriously injured. And I think Captain Kurt Lippold, that may have been his first ship as a captain. The guy was devastated. Here he is, all he's just trying to do is refuel this boat or ship, and they get attacked by terrorists.
Yeah, get back out there and do his job.
But before we even got out to where the ship was, we landed at the airport in Aden, And we sat out there forever. It was hotter than hell. And they said, well, the ambassador at the time, Ambassador Bodine, I think was her name, was not user friendly with us coming into the country with long guns. She didn't want us to look like, an invading force. She was very sensitive to that. And John O'Neill, who coincidentally died 9/11 in the towers, was he was at the New York assistant director in charge, and he was in charge of this investigation. He was trying to negotiate with her on getting us, the team that's going to protect the Americans, in there. And so we sat on that runway, and we sat on that runway, and sat on that runway. It was hot. There's no AC in the 141, and it was miserable. Finally, they said, "Hey, they're gonna let us come in." So we lower the back end of the plane, and there they are with RPGs pointed into the back of the plane. It's the Yemeni military, and we're all kind of like, "That's interesting. I hope they decide not to light one of those off." So they raised the back end back up. Some more negotiations went on, and kind of what they said was, you can come in without your long guns. Well, what do you mean by that? So we had M4s and MP5s, and if I remember correctly, we said, and I can't go into all the gory details, but kind of paraphrasing and going over it lightly, in a nutshell, we said, okay, we'll leave the M4s on the plane, but we're bringing everything else. Well, everything else also meant, we carry explosives with us for breaching, some really sophisticated equipment. We had all kinds of 3-letter agencies on that flight with us. And so we kind of, we said, hey, we'll leave these long guns off. So we were able to kind of negotiate that into letting us in the country. And I remember we had to go through the airport metal detectors, and they were literally like on our bags, which I had everything in my bag you needed to, blow a wall down. And I remember seeing them push those bags through this makeshift magnetometer, and I'm just thinking, I don't know what they're looking for, because whatever they should be looking for is in my bag. And they're just pushing them on through. And I kind of looked around, and, you got a little Yemeni guy sitting there squatted down on, on the ground like they sit. And I kind of look, I'm like, there's no screen. They're not looking at anything. It was kind of a save the face, we're checking your bags. We checked into the Aden Hotel, which was there, which is probably a, 4-star by Yemeni standards hotel. I remember the pillows I think were made out of straw. They were filled with straw. There was dust everywhere. Guys were getting sick from the dust in the air, and the sanitary conditions were not so great. You couldn't drink the water. I remember I didn't get sick. I think I had a cold when I went there, so the air is not very clean. So, I didn't get sick in my stomach. A lot of people did. I remember telling the kid you could order food from their kitchen at the hotel. I'm like, I ordered fried cheese. I'm like, fried cheese up in Greece, 450 degrees, it's going to kill everything. So, I can eat cheese for a while and bottled water. So that's kind of what I survived on. But guys, people were getting sick, and, at nighttime they were shooting at the hotel, and, it was a dangerous situation. I remember going to fill up the trucks, the Suburbans. You can't fly them full of gas. You got to have a quarter tank or less. So we landed, and they asked me and a couple of the guys, let's go get gas in the Suburbans. Well, okay, pay for it just go change some money at the hotel. So I remember going to the hotel and trying to exchange some cash. And, we obviously had some pallets of cash with us. But I said, hey, I need to, so many words, I need to have enough money to fill up all these Suburbans in gas. And okay, well, I gave them several $100s in cash, and they came back with like grocery bags full of Monopoly money. And I'm like, all right, whatever. We took them to the gas station. I pulled up the gas station with a couple buddies of mine, and we fill up the tanks, and gas was pretty cheap. And I got these grocery bags, and I kind of shrugged my shoulders, and I give him the guy the grocery bag. He shrugs his shoulders, and we leave. So, that was that. Rest of the team comes in, and next day we get up and we make our first trip with the investigators over to the ship, and you could, from the hotel, you could see the ship, and it was listing, and you could tell that damn thing was almost ready to sink. And they had brought in a barge, and I think put the barge sort of underneath it to give it some buoyancy so it wouldn't sink. Yeah, going on that ship was crazy because it just literally ripped through the hull of that ship, killed those 17 sailors, wounded, 30, 40 others. It was crazy, crazy. We were there. We had to fly the long guns out of the country, and I got chosen as one of the guys to accompany the weapons back to Germany. And so I got on that 141. It was me, 30 or 40 M4s, and 2 pilots. We flew back into Ramstein and brought all the weapons back, and we were staging from Ramstein, so that was kind of the base. So we brought all the weapons back to our staging area and stayed there, and then I took another flight back to Yemen the next day or a couple days later.
So you conclude your investigation there.
Yeah, they concluded their investigation. There's a great picture of me and all the other investigators in John O'Neill's book, The Man Who Saved America, maybe, or something like that. Or I can't remember what it's called. It's a good picture of all of us on top of the hotel in Aden. And so that concludes, and we didn't know how long we were going to be there. It happened in October. The investigation, we were there for at least a couple weeks, and I think we were in Germany for a couple weeks, so maybe total a month away from home. But we thought they told us, hey, you're going to be here through Christmas. So, yeah, those things are never fun. Unplanned, missing Thanksgiving, Christmas, never fun.
Yeah.
We may have missed Thanksgiving. I don't remember. It was pretty close.
So you come back from that, and then you're back to the usual stuff that you're doing. There's probably some other activity in between that, and
there's missions all along. They had a rotation. You'd be either in duty cycle, training cycle, or mission. And if there was a mission that came up and you were in that window, whatever 90-day window, you would, whatever part of the team you were on that was in that category. If it was mission, then you were off on the mission. If you were in the training cycle, then you were, off somewhere in the U.S. doing some high-speed training with some group or military. I was a breacher, so I got to go down to Virginia Beach with the SEALs, and we got to do a lot of different breaching activities with them. And yeah.
Yep.
So, but there were other missions that would go on. If you were in mission cycle, we got, I went to various countries around the world, various missions to do various things.
Yep. Lots of activity.
Lots of activity. Gone all the time.
Yeah. And it's heating up at this point. You got the embassies blowing up.
Yeah, so prior to the Cole was the bombing of the embassies in Nairobi in Kenya. That was probably 98. Something happened 99. I don't recall. But there were also domestic operations that we were involved in. They had we had a big Hells Angels operation in Virginia Beach we took care of. We were in Puerto Rico a couple different times. The violent gangs down there. There was corruption within the police departments. The local FBI field office was getting shot at with RPGs, so we went down there and handled that. There was various other operations within the U.S. that we did. The HRT, not when I was there, but, they were involved in Ruby Ridge, Waco, big significant events.
Yeah.
So 2000, the next year is 9/11, a little less than a year from the Cole. Cole blew up in 2000. 9/11 was obviously September 2001. And I was physically sitting at FBI headquarters when that happened. So you could see the smoke from the Pentagon. I was watching TV. When I was working on terrorism matters. I was signed up there on a TDY from HRT to help with one of the hostage situations that we had. And I remember driving in that morning. I still have my HRT vehicle. I would pick up my buddies from headquarters. Nobody drives to headquarters. I had a parking spot because I was a guest and a TDYer. And so I picked up a couple of my LA buddies and other people I knew from the hostage rescue team that had moved on. I say, hey, I'm driving in the next few weeks. I'll pick you up in Woodbridge, Manassas, Springfield, I'll give you right into work so you don't have to take the grind, take the train. So I remember driving in that morning, September 11th, and we were all talking about how beautiful it was that day. Virginia in the fall is amazing. It's just amazing. And it is good as a crystal clear day. I remember looking at the TV monitor. One of the guys in the office said, God, Nate, a helicopter just ran into the World Trade Center. And I'm like, it couldn't be any clearer today. What kind of shit? And they're like, oh, it was an airplane. I'm like, man, that's crazy. And as I'm watching, second plane hit. And we knew. We knew. So it was all hell broke loose at headquarters. All the alarms are going off. Everybody's not in a panic, but, now everybody's we're activating the Emergency Operations Center, SIOC. Everybody's, the phone lines were all down. I think the World Trade Centers have the largest trunk of Verizon lines in it on the East Coast. We had priority numbers that we could use to dial out on. I remember calling a couple friends and my brother, who was an agent at the Washington field office, and we had talked a little bit, and I'm like, he was on the evidence response team, and I remember saying to him, you going to New York? He goes, yeah, I'm getting ready to head home now. And I was on the phone with him as he was crossing the 14th Street Bridge, and he said, I'm not going home. I'm like, he goes, the plane just hit the Pentagon. So he got off and went over to the Pentagon. He was one of the first agents there. There's a picture with him and Bush and Cheney, and so he was one of the first agents at the Pentagon.
Crazy.
Crazy.
Absolutely crazy.
Yep.
I don't think anybody ever experienced anything like that before. I mean, Oklahoma City certainly was a shocker, right? But never saw anything like that.
No. Closest thing to it would probably have been Pearl Harbor.
Yeah.
Surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. Yeah. That came out of nowhere. This kind of came out of nowhere. There were obviously some intelligence failures along the way, but there were probably some intelligence failures along the way with Pearl Harbor.
Sure.
So,
yeah. I mean, that was a pretty coordinated effort, right? I mean, that wasn't something that was just like, hey, let's hop on these airplanes. Let's just do this. Like,
no, I worked terrorism in LA. That was the substantive case matters that I was assigned to work. I arrested one of the first guys involved in the first World Trade Center bombing, and just kind of on a fluke, I was doing a trash cover, and that's basically you go to the curb where somebody leaves their trash. It's fair game, and digging through trash, diapers, and imagine when you're digging through trash, imagine what that's like. Maggots and gross stuff. And I came across a phone bill that had maybe a couple phone numbers we didn't have. We did some tracing, and one thing led to another, and we did an arrest. And I had a guy it was totally unexpected that we found this guy. I just happened to be with it was INS at the time, was my partner. And I'm like, hey, let's go check this apartment out, see if he's there. We pulled up, and sure as shit, we found his car, which we hadn't seen for years. And I was on the regular bureau radio, 4 cell phones, and I'm calling for help. I need to get somebody over there. And of course, this time, now it's a high profile case. It was a dog when they handed it to me. Now it's, big deal. And I got people calling, hey, we're coming. I'm like, I think we got it handled. So I had one of my SWAT buddies dress up. He had some PG&E stuff, and he used it often to, as a ruse. And he's like, he comes there, he's like, yeah, I'll put this on, I'll go knock on the door, tell him there's a gas leak. And we had an arrest warrant already. And
got him out, took him down.
Yep, there was 4 people in like a 500 square foot apartment. When the 4 of us went in, with the 4 of them, there's almost no room to turn around. It was pretty tight quarters.
Wow.
And he was known to be sort of like a badass. He was pissing his pants. He cooperated completely. You don't want to get shot. I don't care how tough you are.
Yeah.
Like to tell you stories about what happened with the Hells Angels, when we arrested them, and, one of the baddest of the bad. And the guy was in bed with his wife when we went in, and we threw those flashbangs in there and went into that bedroom, and he was in bed with his wife that was over 9 months pregnant, it looked to me like. And he pretty much whimpered by the time we got in there and cuffed him and put him on his knees. He turned into a badass after he was cuffed, got mouthy, but not before.
Yeah.
Nobody wants to get shot.
Yeah.
Oh.
So post 9/11, all this stuff goes down. You get an assignment. Where are you going? What are you doing?
So I went from the hostage rescue team to the counterterrorism division. I was promoted as a supervisor. And so the Afghanistan war had started. I got assigned to what was called the Gitmo Task Force, and we were responsible for the collection of intelligence from the detainees that they were putting at Bagram and then ultimately down in Guantanamo Bay. And there was a ad hoc group that had been running that before I got there, and I formalized it all, made a whole unit out of it. We had analysts and agents and everybody else, but so I operated that the Guantanamo Task Force for about 3 years, and during the time I was there, we had high value targets that were being captured in Afghanistan and all around the world, and
You got KSM there.
KSM was there.
Yep.
I went to Afghanistan and all these other places, and I've been to these black sites, and I've seen some of the folks that they've captured and everything else. So yeah, worked very closely with all the other 3-letter agencies, and it was very interesting.
At that point in time now, we're talking about peak performance. You've got agencies that weren't really talking to each other the same way previously now that are really talking to one another, and you're really trying to take it up to another level. Threat level is super high. Everybody's still on pins and needles thinking like, hey, there's another attack coming anytime. So now you're tapping into that, and you guys are probably pushing like major weight. You're really working
Working long hours. And I take it back to those mental toughness days of wrestling. Yeah, I was tired. Yeah, I was, exhausted. And now I kind of shifted the focus of the physical performance of what I was able to do to performing at a peak level in an operation. It all kind of translates over. You can carry these qualities over from one aspect of life into the next, into the next, into the next. You don't have to be able to do, 40 or 50 pull-ups and then move into the next phase of your life and do 40 or 50 of your pull-ups to perform. But what you can do is you can look back and go, well, I was able to perform at this level, and I was able to, I knew what it took mentally to do this, so I'm going to carry that over into this next aspect of my life and the next and the next and the next and the next. And it's, if people ask about how did you kind of get to this point, mentally tough, physically tough, and I said it's a lifestyle, it's not a fad. And many people choose to go down the path as a fad. January 1st, the gym's packed, or January 2nd, the gym's packed. By the first week of February, you're the only soul in there again.
Right.
So it's a lifestyle, it's not a fad. And it's not just physical peak performance. You take that physical peak performance and you translate it in the other things you do in life. We all can't be supermen and badasses our whole life, but what we can do is take what we learned when we were full of piss and vinegar and use that and apply that to be successful in business, in life, in whatever aspect it is. Life is hard. When I said earlier, hard work is hard, life is hard. But if you have the skills and the mental toughness, you know that you can overcome personal things. Everybody's gone through personal things. I've gone through personal things, and I've had low points in my life where I look in the mirror and you want to spit in the mirror and you feel bad and you're depressed and you people that get into those deep dark holes, you're like, shit, this must be where they are. How do I get out? And you sit back and wait a minute. You realize that, yeah, I'm not in this deep dark hole. I'm struggling, but I know I can get out because I've been there before. I mean, this may not be the same hole, but I've been down and I've been beat, and I knew that I had to get out, and I knew I had to succeed. And so you go back and you look at that reflection in the mirror and you go, no, I'm not going to allow you to do this. I'm going to get out because I know I can. I've done it before.
Yeah, it sounds like the thread is a decision.
Yeah.
It's a decision in that moment to push forward through tough times, no matter what. And it's not always easy. It's not always going to be fun. You know, there are peaks and valleys, right?
Peaks and valleys. And, like I said earlier, some people find it earlier in life. Some people find it later in life. The unfortunate part is if you find it later in life, you don't necessarily have all the fun physical abilities that if you would have found it earlier in life, whenever your dad said, go out and throw the baseball more, go out and lift weights more, go out and run a little more. Maybe you would have excelled in whatever you were doing. Go study some more. Maybe you would have gotten into Stanford or Harvard. When you're at 50 and you look back and you go, gosh, it's funny. Maybe I should have done that. It's too late, but it's not too late to be successful, and it's not too late to try to be a better person and try to utilize that ability to perform at a peak level, no matter what age you are. Performing at a peak level at 20 may not be the same physically as it is at 50 or 60, but the concept's the same. You don't let off the gas. You may not be going 100 miles an hour when you push on the gas when you're at 60, but if you're going 50, make it the best 50. Don't make it anything less. Do what you can to make it the best. And I think that's kind of how I've tried to carry over. We all have setbacks. We all have done things we wish we hadn't done, but it's how you look at those things in the rearview mirror. When I was coaching, I always gave this analogy of a vehicle. Every 16-year-old wants to have a car. Every 16-year-old knows what a windshield is and what a rearview mirror is. And I used to always say, I said, look, there's a reason why the windshield is 70 times larger than the rearview mirror. And the reason is because what happens in front of you is a hell of a lot more important than what happened behind you. But that mirror is there for you to glance up every once in a while and just take a look at what happened behind you because you may learn something.
Yeah. Learn how to fail forward too.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Take those lessons, apply them to, hey, if you're doing it the right way, it's like, hey, I'm going to actually learn from this, and I'm going to execute differently next time and operate in a way that's going to make me a better person, all those things.
It's hard. It's super hard.
Yep.
We all have failures, and we all, if you're not a psychopath and something happens that's a setback, it's how you deal with that setback to try not to let it happen again.
Yep.
And it may happen again and again and again and again, but you can't give up. I learned long ago when we talked about those early stages of my life, you can throw in the towel. You can tell the coach you got a broken collarbone and quit. You can get your ass kicked a few times and give up. Or you can say, you know what? Nah, I'm going to forge ahead. The windshield's bigger. There's something more important up ahead. So it's about being at your peak performance all the time and never, ever giving up. A good friend of mine asked me about, hey, you trained with the Navy SEALs. You got friends that are Navy SEALs. My son wants to be a Navy SEAL. Is it all about swimming? He's an okay swimmer. And I called one of my SEAL buddies, and I said, what I told the guy was, I said, it's about never quitting, never give up. And he goes, yeah, that's true. He goes, it's funny. Somebody asked him one time about being a swimmer and being a wrestler. And he said, he goes, you can teach a wrestler to swim, but you can't teach a swimmer to be tough. And I'm not knocking swimmers. I'm just saying, mental toughness is a really, really difficult thing to adapt to. And I'll guarantee you, swimming, you asked Michael Phelps about swimming, hats off. That guy is tough as nails. Wrestling is a hard sport, and it inherently, everything about it makes you mentally, physically, you are completely exhausted, and you're expected to go out on that mat and perform time and time again in front of everybody. You don't go into a dark room. You don't jump on you're not on the football field with 11 other players. The quarterback throws a bad pass, you don't catch it. No, it's you and your opponent in front of everybody. And only one guy walks away with his hand raised. That's humbling. That teaches you humility, but it also teaches you that, hey, I got to go back and do this again and again and again.
So we could talk about so many things. I think we could just go on and on for hours. You finish up your career, San Francisco field office, second in command. You retire, and then you take a job with a company, head of security. I don't know what your exact title was at that point in time, but then you transition into another organization. And what's it like for you as someone who has operated at such a high level when you're around others who don't operate at that level?
That's a challenge. I've managed people most of my adult life in some form or fashion, either as a coach, team leader, a manager in the corporate world. And people that know my background, I think sometimes, I don't want to call it are intimidated. It's sort of a mystery to some because of the FBI title. Others that know my background as a wrestler wonder about, like, what in the hell's wrong with you? That sport's crazy. And so I go back to the whole mental toughness thing again, and never giving up, and how to develop, teams, be respectful to people. It's hard. It's, the expectation. I obviously have put tremendously high expectations on myself. I always have. And that can be a challenge as a person, as a friend, as a spouse, as a manager, because people look at you and they feel as though that's what you expect out of them. And there's good and bad to it. One, it's good because I believe that people will rise to the occasion. I always give people the benefit of doubt. Some need a little coaching and pushing to get to that level. That people want to perform. People don't want to be slackers. Slackers don't perform. Slackers don't get paid well. Slackers don't achieve success in whatever it is. I don't care if you're, somebody that's mopping the floor or you're in charge of the entire organization. If you're a slacker in either one of those, you're not going to be successful. And I always tell people that my peers, my coworkers, my subordinates, you don't have to live up to do what I do or what I did, but take it as an example of what you're capable of doing. Be the best. Don't settle for second best. Don't settle for something that's mediocre. Mediocrity gives you exactly that. If you want to be successful, you got to push, because hard work is hard. And if you're a high-performing person, my guess is that you will never have people that perform at the level that you think they should perform to. Sometimes there are. You got great coaches that have great players that have done great things and gone off to be Olympic gold medalists. But those are that small group. You've got to learn to recognize that not everybody's an Olympic gold medalist. Not everybody is a peak performer. But your job as somebody that was given that gift of peak performance, given that gift of recognizing what it took to get from A to B and all that hard work in between, it's your job to try to coach and get people to move in that direction. It's easy to just let them fall off the map. I'm not going to deal with that person. Well, now I think you have responsibility in life to give people the same opportunity that you had to be a peak performer. Maybe I learned about it at 14. I thank God for that. But those that didn't learn about it at a young age, for whatever reason, weren't in the right environment, didn't have the right parental setting, whatever it might be, but recognize that peak performance is available to us all. It's a mindset, and people have the ability to achieve that goal. They have to put their mind and body to it. It's not easy. Hard work is hard. Getting to be a peak performer is hard. You won't interview any person that was part of any special operations group, any Olympic caliber athlete, any D1 athlete, whatever the sport is. They're not going to tell you, yeah, I was just a natural. I was gifted. Maybe you were, but it wasn't the gift of your physical abilities that got you there. It was your gift of recognizing what it took to be a peak performer that got you there. The gift isn't your physical tools. The gift is how you mentally got yourself to that point and learned that, hey, I can put these tools together and be a peak performer.
All right. So, amen. And I think the last thing I want to say here or talk about is, all right, you find somebody later in life, they're coming to this point in time, they haven't had sort of, win streak, but they want it. So if you were going to give a playbook, super simple, something that somebody could do, get up tomorrow, hey, how do you start executing? What are the things that you're going to do? And that's kind of vague because we're talking about all different types of people.
Yeah.
What are, if you could just break it down, maybe 3 or 5 things that you think are super important for people to do in order to start moving towards that peak performance?
Yeah, great question. Admiral McCraven spoke at the UT graduation. He was a Navy SEAL, and I don't keep referring to SEALs because I think they're, the best of the best. I personally think they are, but I have a lot of friends that are, and I admire that group. He said it best, and people ask him the same question. He talked about peak performance. How do I get to be the peak performance of a Navy SEAL? And his response was, it starts with making your bed in the morning. And he uses that analogy is it starts with the first thing in the day. You've got to do something to start with. You've got to perfect something initially. And when he was going through buds, it was about making that rack perfectly with the pillow in the right place. So when you walked out of the room, I started my day with doing something right. May it be a simple task, it may be a mundane task, but that's how I started it. And I think being a peak performer is you have to start somewhere. And there's no bottom, there's no top, there's a starting point. And so if you have a starting point, there's always a finishing point. And the hard work is what falls in between the two ends of the spectrum. And you've got to decide, where's that starting point? What is it? How do I do it? How do I perfect it? And it might be as simple as making your bed in the morning, cleaning your house. These are all simple things. These are all tasks that you perfect. And when you walk away, you fold your arms, you're like, I did that. That looks good. And that allows you to go into the next one and the next one and the next one. Maybe the next one is more complicated. Maybe the next one's more involved. Maybe in the next one you need to do it with people that you have to develop some sort of teamwork or network. So you got to perfect that. So it's all these building blocks, and it started with something simple. And so you have to have that starting point where you're able to accomplish something to perfection. And it might be just making your bed.
Pretty cool. Well, I'm humbled to have you here, Jeff. You're an outstanding guy.
No, I'm glad I was able to talk to you about this. And if anybody's able to get one nugget of the whatever amount of time we talked here, then mission accomplished. And I'm humbled by the fact you asked me to come here. I, think in life that, I was very lucky at a lot of things that came my way. And my coach told me in high school, God rest his soul, he said, you know what? Luck's 99% hard work. So you can be lucky all you want, but I know how you got there.
Maybe we'll call this episode just that. Luck is 99% hard work.
All right.